Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and with the NBA trade deadline recently having passed, I figured now would be a good time to look back at a past NBA trade deadline, this one being back in 2011, which had some really big moves in it. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how those things kind of panned out long term. But really quickly before we get started, if you enjoy the NBA, then consider subscribing. I upload basically every single day. Really quickly too, before this actually gets started, I love doing these kinds of videos, but I don't do them as often just because I don't really know how you guys feel about them. So if you enjoy these, you want to see more than leaving likes, comments, things like that, any kind of feedback is much appreciated. All right, so I think there's 5 big deals we're going to cover here in this Bleacher Report article about the 2011 trade deadline. We will get to some bigger ones later, but first is the LA Clippers getting Mo Williams, Jamario Moon in exchange for Baron Davis and a first-round pick. And this is really interesting because Williams at one point was an all-star, I believe, in Cleveland when LeBron was first there, and the Clippers at this point, they had Blake Griffin, they had Chris Kaman, and they, I guess, were looking to get better perimeter help. Baron Davis wasn't all that good at this point, and the Clippers gave up a first-round pick, and if I remember correctly, that is the pick that they used to get Tristan Thompson in the Kyrie draft. That's why they had 2 picks, or it was a different draft, and I'm remembering that incorrectly, but I think it was the Tristan Thompson one that they ended up getting out of this deal, which is crazy that it was a pick this high just for swapping point guards. But I want to read you a sentence out of this article here really quickly. The Clippers definitely get a little stronger here. Assuming Williams can get healthy, his substantially superior over Davis's perimeter shooting should come in handy with the attention that Blake Griffin and Chris Kaman will attract down low. That is a 2011 sentence if I've ever read one. Long term, like I said, the impacts of this with a first round pick, but there are some bigger ones we definitely want to get to, including this one. The New Jersey Nets get Deron Williams, the Jazz get Devin Harris, Derrick Favors, and 2 first-round picks. So really quickly, let's take ourselves back to 2011. So at this deadline, it was clear that the Nets wanted to make a move. Mikhail Prokhorov wanted a star in Brooklyn, or a star in New Jersey at the time as they were about to move to Brooklyn. And the conversation was around potentially Carmelo Anthony. There was like a week and a half where I legitimately thought the Nets were going to get Melo. Then there was a conversation about Dwight Howard potentially. And this Deron Williams thing was really not rumored. Obviously, this is back in 2011 where trade rumors are not as big of a deal, at least for fans. But this definitely came out of nowhere. And apparently Deron Williams and Jerry Sloan just weren't getting along. There was a falling out there. And they just said, screw it. We're going to trade the guy away. And at the time, he was one of the best point guards in the entire league. Unfortunately, his health was not able to hold up enough for him to sustain that success for multiple years in New Jersey. But initially, he was really good, had a couple of epic games for the Nets. And as I'm sure all of you know, that era of Nets basketball just never really came together. But this was the start of trading away all those first round picks and all these younger players to get veterans like Kevin Garnett and like Gerald Wallace and like Paul Pierce later down the road. But the compensation here is Devin Harris, who was an all-star at one point for the Nets, Derrick Favors, who was with Utah for forever. He had just been drafted, I think, with the 4th pick or the 3rd pick, a very high draft pick. Never became like a star or anything, but was a good player for them for a while and is still now a pretty good player in New Orleans, and 2 first-round picks. Now again, the Deron Williams thing, he was very good and it came out of nowhere, but this is a ton, even by today's standards, to be giving up in exchange for a player like that. Like I said, I loved it when the move was first made as a fan, as someone that wasn't paying as much attention to compensation and to future value and to actually getting good value in a trade. I was like, oh my gosh, Deron Williams is so good. This is going to be fun. And unfortunately, just not having those picks came back to bite this team, and then they made some other bad moves down the road as well. But initially, it was really fun having Deron Williams around. Next up is really a huge trade in terms of the long-term effects of the league. The Boston Celtics get Jeff Green, Nenad Krstić, and the Thunder get Kendrick Perkins and Nate Robinson. Now, obviously, Perkins was a player that had helped the Celtics win a championship in 2009, if I'm remembering correctly, with Ray Allen and Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce, and those guys was an important part of that. But at this point, they were looking to potentially mix some things up, and the Thunder really wanted a playoff-proven veteran and a really solid center because at the time they had KD, they had Russ, they had James Harden, and they wanted to build a group that was worthy of potentially getting to the finals later on. They wanted a playoff-proven veteran, right? And Kendrick Perkins represented that, and they were willing to give up someone in Jeff Green that was very talented, and they initially got in the Ray Allen trade, ironically, with Boston, but in some sense it worked out, right? Like, I'm sure there were some positive things for that team out of having Kendrick Perkins there, but by the time they actually got to the finals, he was a shell of his former self, and by all accounts, from a statistical standpoint, was a detriment for that team. And it was the era, right? It was the style of basketball that was being played where you needed that traditional big guy on the floor. But in hindsight, if they'd put Ibaka, KD, Russ, Harden, and a shooter out there, they would have dominated any team in the postseason that year. But they felt like they had to play Perkins, and in the minutes that he played, they just weren't very good at all. So in the long term, you could almost say, if they'd never made this deal, in terms of on the court in that final series, maybe they end up winning a championship, and that changes the arc of the entire rest of the league after that with KD leaving and things like that. But you could also make the argument that Perkins represented a big maturation process for this team and a sign that they really wanted to push for something special with that group, and maybe they never get there without him in the first place. It's hard to say with some of those off the court things, but on the court, it would have been nice for them to have recognized the advantage they had without Perkins on the floor, as opposed to feeling like they needed to play him as a result of making this move. Now we're going to get to the Portland Trailblazers getting Gerald Wallace and the Bobcats getting Joel Prisbilla, Dante Cunningham, Sean Marks, and 2 first-round picks. And this is intriguing for me because the Nets, I believe the season right after this, traded for Gerald Wallace at the deadline for a top 3 protected first-round pick that ended up becoming Damian Lillard. But at the time, the Trailblazers wanted to get another good wing. The Bobcats were once again rebuilding. Wallace had been, I believe, an all-star for them at one point, if I'm remembering correctly, and then they get the first-round picks. I don't remember what the picks became, but it's still just interesting that Gerald Wallace at one point was worth that much to Portland. And it didn't work out long-term in terms of Gerald Wallace's career in Portland or honestly in New Jersey / Brooklyn either. But in a roundabout way, that Gerald Wallace asset got them Damian Lillard because the Nets, even though they had a bad record, traded a top 3 protected pick in exchange for Gerald Wallace to kind of continue to build this core up that never ended up happening. And that pick landed wherever Lillard got drafted, 6 or 8 or something like that, because the Nets were thinking in that draft they only really liked 3 players, so they didn't need to do anything other than protect the pick for the top 3. And it turns out, an All-NBA caliber player in Damian Lillard was right there at 6 or 8 or whatever, and they didn't get to use that pick on him. So, and now we get to probably one of the biggest trades at the trade deadline in the last decade of the NBA. Biggest in terms of impact, but also biggest just in terms of the number of players involved. So the Knicks get Carmelo Anthony, Chauncey Billups, Sheldon Williams, Anthony Carter, Ronaldo Bachman, and Corey Brewer in exchange for Raymond Felton, Wilson Chandler, Danilo Gallinari, Timofey Mozgov, Kosta Koufos, and the Timberwolves get Anthony Randolph and Eddie Curry. There is so much happening here. I've actually covered this in an NBA Trade Rewind video in the past, so if you haven't seen that, that explains this trade specifically a lot better than I'm going to be able to off the top of my head here. But the important thing, or the most important thing that's been remembered about this deal, was the fact that the Knicks never had to make it. And Melo probably, it's like a 90% chance that he would have signed with them as a free agent. He wanted to be in New York. He wanted to be a Knick. They didn't need to trade away these assets. And this is probably the one time in the last decade that they actually had some really good things going in a tangible way in New York in terms of assets, in terms of younger players. They brought in Amari Stoudemire the year before, or the first year that Amari was there. Raymond Felton was playing really well. They had Wilson Chandler, they had Gallinari, they had guys that were good on the wings. They had an interesting young team, and if they had just stood pat and signed Melo, they probably would have ended up being one of the best teams in the league. I mean, a couple years later, they shot a ton of threes, and they had the J.R. Smiths and Amon Shumperts of the world on the team, and they ended up playing really well, and they just fizzled out in the postseason because they decided not to shoot threes anymore for whatever reason. But had they kept this group in addition to the guys they had on that team, honestly, like, they could have competed with the Heatles of that era and maybe even won a championship because they were so good. They spaced the floor, they shot a ton of threes, even giving up as much as they did. And then moving forward for the Nuggets, this kind of helped them build a team that ended up winning 50 plus games while George Karl was still there. And then there's some pieces on their current roster that are still there as a result of this deal, whether it's future trades or other picks that aren't mentioned here that got conveyed later on. I believe Gary Harris ended up being a part of this deal in the long term, and or Jamal Murray. There's a huge part of the Nuggets core right now that came out of this Melo deal that, again, the Knicks never had to make in the first place. And so unfortunately for Knicks fans, that's kind of the long-term legacy of the 2011 trade deadline. Is seeing how well they played a couple years later, I think they won over 50 games for the first time in forever, and seeing how good that team was and what it could have been like had they kept guys like Felton and Chandler and Gallinari. And it might not seem like it now because you're thinking about current day Wilson Chandler and then the Raymond Felton that's been a backup point guard for a handful of years. But when Amari first got there, and that's the other part of this as well, if he had stayed healthy, things would have been wildly different as well. But when he first got there, the Knicks were legitimately fun, and they were like over 500 through their first 40 games or something. Like, they actually were a legitimately good team with pieces like this, not even considering the fact you could add Melo. I don't 100% know off the top of my head what their cap situation was, if they could have even signed Melo outright without moving some pieces around because they had just signed Amari previously. Regardless, this could have been such a better team if they didn't make this move. And honestly, it's one of the most impactful trades of the last 10 years in the NBA, not necessarily in terms of championships. Things like the Kawhi trade are more impactful in terms of the success at a championship level for a couple of teams. But in terms of a trade that had such a huge impact at the time and continues to be a huge deal with current NBA rosters, I don't think you can do much better than really this 2011 trade deadline as a whole, with the Gerald Wallace thing that ended up hurting the Nets down the road, the Deron Williams thing that hurt the Nets at the time as well as down the road, and then this Melo thing as well. This was a really, really interesting trade deadline, and it makes me wish that NBA YouTube existed in its current capacity back then, because it would have been super fun to kind of hear everybody's opinions on it. But yeah, there you have it. That is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.